In the lead up to version 6.4, I realized it was the first time in Genshin's history I expected a satisfying finale to a region's story. I started back in version 2.0, so by the time I caught up, the Inazuma arc was basically done, and overall I found the first 3 regions Archon Quest to be fun, but very flawed. In Sumeru, I was invested in rescuing Nahida, but the Samsara had been a chore and my expectations were still low, so the level of emotional depth the finale reached was a huge surprise for me. Fontaine was in the middle. The first 2 chapters had been fun, but Meropide was painful, so I went in uncertain whether they could recapture that moment of pure magic. When it came to Natlan, I was excited but nervous. I enjoyed the first 4 acts, but hated the interlude and had a lot of complaints about the storytelling. I still had hopes they would deliver for the 3rd year in a row, but I was uncertain, and as you might know, I ended massively disappointed anyway. This time around, the changes to their storytelling in Not Cry left me with an unfamiliar feeling, excitement, without the fear that it would fall apart in the end. Now that it's over, did Hoyo deliver? First, what exactly were we expecting? From the first moment Not Cry was announced, Hoyo promised it would be different to previous regions. They acknowledged some of the fundamental issues which held Genshin's story back, and said this new chapter would have more immersive storytelling, a layered narrative with multiple factions, richer relationships, and characters' histories in the spotlight. This addressed some of the critiques I've explored in the past, the deeper structural issues which prevented many players from engaging with the narrative hidden in the game's lore. Most players knew little of the concepts which would presumably become central in Chesnaya, so there was a risk that the climax of Tevat's arc would end up falling flat. They didn't address the more surface-level concerns, the presentation, the narrative structure of each chapter, the excessive dialogue, the pacing, and so on. However, those aspects had been improving over time, especially in later Natlan. It goes without saying that there'll be many people who had different expectations to my own. If yours were different, then don't take any of this as me denying your existence. I'd actually love to hear what you expected, and whether yours were paid off in the end as well. Personally, in the weeks before 6.0, I was excited, but have to admit that deep down I did not expect it to feel all that different in the end. As I covered in depth in a previous video, the first 3 patches of Not Cry delivered, and not only on the aspects Hoyo promised to improve. The story hooks were compelling, and right from the start we got so many answers, which often led to more questions to explore. The deeper lore felt central to the narrative for the first time. And while I still think the transition into Nefer's backstory was a little jarring, everything else about the characters in Not Cry has been great, and I can't wait to do a deeper dive into some of them once I've got the time. I also love to see all of these groups with conflicting perspectives, which made them all feel separate, since it made their cooperation feel meaningful. They worked together in spite of their differences, and forged friendships over the course of the story, which led to deeper ties and an emerging sense of shared community by the end. And the presentation was much improved. Good cinematography, dialogue with actual subtext, environmental storytelling which expressed the central conflict, and not to mention more cutscenes than before, with animation just as good as the best from Natlan. There's still lots of room for improvement, and some sections fell back into the bad habits of info dumping and bloated dialogue, but for almost the entire time I was no longer distracted by flaws in its presentation. And I particularly liked that the actions we took to solve our problems in the earlier acts led directly to the complications we faced in the later ones. I assumed this was what Hoyo meant by layered narrative. I would call it good storytelling. So, in the lead up to the grand finale, what expectations and hopes did we have? Personally, what I cared about the most was Columbina. I'm planning a video exploring her in detail, but overall she went from the one Harbinger I found kinda uninteresting to one of my favourite characters in the entire game. So when they finished off Act 6 with a cliffhanger which saw her sacrifice herself diving headfirst through the moon gate, of course my absolute #1 expectation for the finale was that we would rescue her somehow. The other obvious expectation was that Dottore would be the central antagonist. He had been working in the shadows, completely hidden from our view, until finally at the end he came in and shattered our plans. We needed to make him pay for what he'd done. I also expected further exploration of the moon-related lore. The final chapter of a story is often seen as a bad place to focus on lore, but Not Cry's purpose is to deepen our understanding of the world, so its narrative function is a little different than usual. Columbina's backstory felt quite well explored through the earlier acts, but there were still many questions and I expected answers. And of course, I expected them to continue with the improved storytelling which had been evident throughout Not Cry, especially their willingness to show multiple perspectives on the same series of events, with our allies splitting up to tackle different tasks together, all leading towards a big climactic confrontation at the end. All those things I expected, but there were others I was less certain about. For example, as I mentioned, I really liked how they handled consequences so far, with our decisions in earlier sections of them coming back to haunt us. I always want more of that, since it makes for such a satisfying story, but at the same time, it's not essential. I also kinda hoped Rerir would return as an antagonist. Dottore and Rerir are both such different challenges to face. One, a psychopathic but ultimately logical and calculating villain, the other so corrupted that he's just a malevolent force of nature at this point. Genshin often lacks compelling villains, so while Dottore is even better, I hope this was not the last we'd see of Rerir too. And the same goes for thematic depth. Up until this point, every part of the story touched on ideas of belonging and identity, and the question of finding a place to call home. It gave everything that little extra depth, a shared soul which brought it all together. And similarly, while I hoped the travelers' search for their spaceship would continue to be treated with importance, I kind of expected it to be sidelined into post-quest dialogue, with any actual payoff left relegated to a Dainsleif quest we could expect in the later Not Cry patches. And I also hoped we'd see some meaningful changes. More character growth, more changing relationships, and hopefully some lasting consequences for the world itself. Characters and relationships had been such a strength to Not Cry so far that I really wanted it to continue, and I'm always wishing for our actions to feel like they matter. When talking about all this in the lead up to Luna 4, I was just genuinely excited. It crossed my mind that they could completely drop the ball, but the storytelling in Acts 1 to 6 had been so competent and deliberate that I just did not think they would. I had a voice in the back of my head saying that perhaps my expectations were too high and I risked being disappointed yet again, but as I've said before, we should demand genuinely good stories from these games. If they were to fall short, then that's just life. All we can ask is that they try, and have open discussions about where things miss the mark, not take it as a sign that we should lower our standards. In the interests of not having this video be hours long, I'll leave any kind of detailed recap for my yearly retrospective and instead focus on that important question: did they actually deliver on those expectations? For simplicity, let's just go from top to bottom through each of the things I was expecting and hoping for, and then at the end we'll talk about some other positives and negatives and what questions we're left with at the end to be explored in future quests. Of course, my biggest and most important expectation was pushed aside right from the first moment of the quest, and honestly, it made more sense this way. It starts with the group meeting up to figure out how to combat Dottore. Some stay back to guard Nasha Town, while others set out to meet Arlecchino and Sandrone to infiltrate his research facility. They don't know for sure that Columbina's even alive at that point, and I mean technically she isn't. They have no clue how they could even begin to bring her back, and when there's a psychotic megalomaniac trying to turn himself into a literal god, destroying the fabric of reality along the way, they have perhaps more immediate concerns. And this let Columbina's story unfold at a more measured pace, giving it the time and weight that it deserved, giving her agency in her own return, and allowing us to dive far deeper into her origins and nature than I expected. I loved everything about this sequence. The realization that all those odd moments in past quests where some mysterious influence helped us on our way were Columbina touching the world as she travelled back through time was great. Revisiting them with this new perspective made them all the more poignant, especially that crucial moment when we call out her name, and the realization about Luonotar's creation and purpose made so much sense. This was very much like Interstellar, except in this case it all felt completely natural. Meanwhile, Dottore was every bit the antagonist that I had hoped for. He was menacing and manipulative and seemed a truly unstoppable force we had little hope of defeating. His only weakness was his insatiable desire to study everything around him, to dissect each person's motivations and understand how they tick. Even though he had the power to destroy everyone on a whim, he was too engrossed in studying their reactions to ever deny himself that intellectual satisfaction. I think this is a pretty risky character archetype to go with. He could so easily have come across as the stereotypical mustache-twirling, monologuing villain who is ultimately so full of hubris that any sense of threat is simply absent, especially because in a gacha game, there's never really any chance of our heroes failing. Hoya did a great job of getting the balance right. I especially loved his interactions with the Traveler. His pointed questions, which skirted with breaking the fourth wall, were so much fun because yes, we do grow weary of being stuck in the same loop day after day. It was very satisfying to finally defeat him, though of course I highly doubt that's the last we'll see of him. And when it came to lore, even though I was expecting it to be important, I did not expect us to literally meet the ancient moon goddesses. After the first few sections of Columbina's journey into the past turned out to be such poignant payoffs to those mysterious moments in earlier quests, and after she encountered Rerir and Thalindis, she set out to journey further into the past in search of deeper answers. Since I had a lot of questions, even if the truth of Columbina's origins had been presented as some dusty murals and verbose texts we need to piece together, I would have been engrossed. Instead, we got to meet her moon sisters. They had actual unique designs instead of generic NPCs, plus I loved their interactions. This whole section felt alive because of the emotions and tensions between them, and the answers to all those questions came one after another. The things we learned made sense of everything that happened up until that point, and the solution to Columbina's return felt like it emerged naturally from the setup. The deeper integration of the lore into Not Krai's story has been a huge positive. And when it comes to storytelling and narrative structure, there were some moments which took longer than they needed, but that's much less of a problem when it's an exception, not the norm. When an entire quest is crammed with empty fluff, it feels like a never-ending slog. Here, even those group scenes standing around and debating were often full of purpose, so the few which overstayed their welcome had little effect on the pacing overall. The high-level narrative structure deserves a lot of praise. Not Krai has leaned into these wider stories with several groups of characters off doing things in parallel, each confronting different challenges and uncovering key information, then coming back together and strategizing once more. Such stories risk feeling bloated, but even though so much happened, they didn't inflate the duration of each quest. And in these final acts, Columbina's thread paid off their layered narrative promise with aplomb. It revisited key moments across all those sprawling tales, added new depth to some which already stood out as highlights, and tied it all together in such a satisfying way. Overall, everything I had expected from the story was more than satisfactory. But what about the things I'd hoped to see? When it comes to consequences within the story, I can't think of anything specific that we did along the way which came back to bite us before the end, except perhaps the traveler getting captured. Dottore turned out to be such a formidable opponent that there wasn't any space for things like that. However, those payoffs along Columbina's journey filled this gap for me. This hope is all about wanting things which happen early in the story to feel like they affect what happens later on, and while that's most obvious through negative consequences, it can be done through other means. I adore narratives which play with time, and going back to influence those crucial moments absolutely scratched this itch for me, even though it was disconnected from the threat we faced in the end. Rerir did return, but was a shadow of his former self, no longer a malevolent force of nature. His abyssal power was stripped away, and all that's left is his human soul, filled with regret. I don't hate what they did with him, and in some ways it's a fitting end to his story, though I'm not sure Thalindis deserved such a lonely fate, but it is a little sad that all his potential for utter chaos and destruction vanished into the void. Dottore was more than enough evil to carry this entire finale on his own, so it didn't make all that big a difference in the end, but I hope that if we encounter other sinners in the future, Rerir turns out to be just a hint of how destructive they can be. On the other hand, when it comes to thematic depth, they put ideas like belonging and identity front and center once again. Columbina's arc has revolved around this from the very start of Not Krai, and here we got a truly fitting conclusion. She discovered the true fate of her predecessors, found acceptance amongst them along with a passing of the torch where they granted her the full power of all three moons, and in return she gave them closure too. She found that her connection to Not Krai was deeper than she ever imagined, and she finally made the choice to accept her place in the people's hearts. Meanwhile, the search for the Traveler's spaceship was sidelined for the vast majority of this patch until after Dottore is defeated, when we sail to the moon and find it waiting there. I think this quest would have felt satisfying even without this epilogue, and they could have just pushed this back to the inevitable Dainsliff quest and it would have probably been fine, but it's great to see yet more movement on this long neglected plot. It's also great to finally have an alternate skin for the Traveler, though I still think we should get a new one themed for each region we visit. And finally, I hoped for some meaningful changes, and when it comes to the characters, the finale was great on this point. Columbina is, of course, the star, and she finally accepted her place among the people of Not Krai and chose to accept Lauma's offer for her to live with the Frostmoon Scions. I loved that this was treated as a new beginning. For now, the elders are timid around her, but the children are more curious and open. There's also personal growth for several other characters, and even Not Krai as a whole is moving forwards. We had all these disparate groups working together once again, but this time, by the end, the bonds they forged had overcome their differences, and they're beginning to put in place new ways to work together for a brighter future. And they even did this for characters who were mostly sidelined throughout the finale. Inefa had very little screen time, but she's a great example of how to utilize a character who isn't in the spotlight. At the start, they made it clear that she would be handling the evacuation. Then, at the end, they paid it off by showing a normal kid from Nasha Town hero worship her. It felt exactly like the kind of thing a child would feel towards a protector in their time of need, and it was lovely to see Inefa appreciated and accepted by the people she helped. And when it comes to the world, I do still wish they'd find some way for our actions to have some visible changes on the world, like battle scars for example, but at least this time, the fight mostly took place on a magic platform in the sky, so it doesn't feel as jarring as in some past regions. The wings on Columbina statue look like they'll be a nice touch, at least, but I won't have them for at least another month because of that stupid time gate for the Selene Chronicles, though more on that in my Columbina video. There are also a couple of unexpected positives which I really want to call out. First, the boss fights with the Dottore were actually kinda fun. Most bosses in Genshin end up feeling anticlimactic. Even when they manage to make them look good, the mechanics range from mundane time wasters to actively frustrating bullshit with no redeeming qualities. There were a few where they tried to get creative, but these gave too much focus on their one-time mechanics at the expense of making the combat aspect feel irrelevant, and ended up a little too gimmicky for my preferences. It's too early to tell how the Dottore boss fight will feel in the long run, but in the moment, it was legitimately fun, and I've enjoyed repeating it to farm for materials. His powers manipulate the fundamental nature of reality, while his desire is to be recognized as a god, and both of these were expressed through his mechanics without making the combat feel irrelevant. He gives commands and rewards us if we comply, or punishes us if we choose defiance. He flips our sense of direction, which is such a fun idea rendered a little pointless by the auto-targeting built into most characters. And he calls forth gigantic attacks, which we have to shelter from in order to survive. These mechanics are fun, appropriate, and don't overshadow the importance of combat during this fight. While it's still less mechanically engaging than the boss fights you'll see in other games, it stands out as a creative and engaging battle which plays to the strengths of Genshin's system while adding something new to express the personality and powers of our enemy. This one might be a little controversial, but I actually quite liked Sandrone in the end. I've seen many express their disappointment that yet again Hoyo made a Harbinger far less antagonistic than people had expected at first, but more on that in the negative section later on. Putting that whole question aside, and taking the Sandrone we got in the Not Krai arc at face value, she seems much like a typical tsundere, someone who appears cold and hostile at first, but slowly reveals their inner warmth. This is another which can feel far too cliche, but I think there are two reasons she worked for me. First, they didn't push her too far towards expressing her growing warmth, and they kept her prickly exterior right until the end. Second, those more subtle interactions which revealed the truth behind her cold demeanor all involved other characters I already liked. Columbina won me over pretty quickly, and her interactions with Sandrone were always fun to see and filled with subtext which I couldn't help but find adorable. I already liked Arlecchino, but her slight contradiction when Sandrone tries to pretend she didn't care about the Traveler's Return was hilarious. After all that build-up, her sacrifice at the end felt fitting, especially because her trusting in her friends became a key reason we were able to defeat Dottore, something he did not foresee as possible. It's pretty obvious that she'll return, with the Fontaine Institute presumably putting her core into a new body. I just hope it doesn't feel like a reset to a completely new personality. And speaking of character resets, back when Wanderer was wiped from Irmingsoul, I remember feeling like his story ended up a little bit lackluster, especially at the end. He somehow went from a character I loved to hate to one who didn't make me feel much either way. His part in Simulanka began to win me over, and over the course of Not Krai, he's been a welcome surprise. His relationship with During, in particular, is one I always look forward to, and I loved his interactions with the Harbingers. He knows them intimately and can't help but make barbed observations, and their reactions are priceless. I particularly like that he demonstrated his trust in the Traveler by accepting our faith in Sandrone's good intentions, even though it put him in such a vulnerable position. He's a great example of how to bring older characters into the story. It makes sense that he'd be there, he plays a crucial role in important events, other characters' personalities shine through their interactions with him, and he shows continued growth and change as a person, yet his presence does not inflate the length of the story. It makes it all feel rich and alive. Now, when it comes to things which bothered me, the one which annoyed me the most was the complete and utter lack of moments to take a break. Technically, you could force quit the quest, but you had no way to know just how much of it you'd have to repeat. I was burned by that once in the past. I played an hour of Samsara quest, but had to stop playing partway through, only to find the entire quest started from the beginning once I returned. I do not want to go through that again. This time, I was aware the quest would be long, so I started a good 3 hours before dinner time, with the hope I'd be able to take a break to cook and eat after Act 7, and then play the rest afterwards. Instead, after a full 3.5 hours, I discovered that the moment Act 7 ends, it instantly starts Act 8, with no opportunity to step away in between. I should have force quit then, but I assumed that surely they'd at least have a breakpoint after the intro to the next section. Unfortunately, I was mistaken, so I did end up having to replay a small chunk of Act 8 after eventually giving up and quitting mid-scene. I really hope they get the balance on this better in the future. I understand that they're aiming for immersion. It's often been annoying when quests pause mid-conversation, ask you to walk a few meters and then continue, but only because it was happening constantly and at points which were not natural breaks in the flow of the story. We want something in between. Don't give us a 6-hour quest without a break, just add a few of those moments in between disconnected scenes. One aspect of the story which feels a little like a missed opportunity is the Palestar edict. I'd be unsurprised if most people forgot what the heck it even was by now. The God's Limits teaser set up that the Tsaritsa had issued an edict, ordering the Fatui to retrieve the damselette from Krai, whatever it takes. Columbina left Snezhnaya on her own volition, and clearly the Harbingers would be at odds with one another on how to handle such a task, but to me it felt like ominous foreshadowing for a major confrontation, at the very least between Columbina and the Harbingers, but perhaps with some working against the Tsaritsa's stated goals. Instead, Dottore tried to capture Columbina for his own reasons, while both Sandrone and Arlecchino ignored the edict entirely, until eventually it was cancelled after Dottore's true intentions were discovered. So much other awesome stuff happened that it's hard to see where they could have included all of that, but it's still sad to see such an evocative idea fail to have any payoff. Many feel a similar way about the Harbingers in general. Before we met them, they seemed like powerful villains shrouded in mystery. Many people love a good antagonist, and the way they were presented set expectations high, especially after the iconic Winter Night's Lasso. But each one we met turned out to be more sympathetic than had been expected. This may come from the fact that all we really knew of them before were their reputations, plus some minor anecdotes from characters like Child, who are far from reliable sources of truth. People's hopes for strong antagonists led them to take those at face value, and speculation led to headcanons about each one's personality, which ended up far from accurate. So far, Dottore is the only one who fits the anime villain archetype which many were hoping for, and he has undeniably been one of the biggest strengths of Krai's finale. I can sympathize with people's disappointment that Sandrone didn't end up like that too, even though I warmed up to her in the end. Personally, I like stories which avoid pure black and white morality, which present their protagonists as flawed and their villains as redeemable, with some few exceptions who are truly psychopathic. Genshin could definitely do with some more antagonists like Dottore, or Rerir as he was first presented, but in the end, I'm just hoping the Sinners and the Shades can take on that role instead. And finally, something I always want the ending to do is set things up for the next chapter. I feel like this is something Genshin pushed to the background a little too much in the past. The story is a travelogue where we witness or even take part in momentous events in each new region, so it does make sense for each finale to focus on concluding that region's story, but it always meant that the next story felt very distant by the end, and they left themselves a lot of work to do to build anticipation. This time around, there are many threads which will pull the story forwards. Varga called in the favor owed to him by the Hexen Circle. Surely this will have unintended consequences later on. And what actually happened at the border defended by the witches? What border was it anyway, since it's clearly not the false sky itself? And they said that whatever happened there made Teyvat easily detectable by the abyss. What will that lead to? Or, on another tack entirely, Columbina gave the moon marrows to Lauma and Arlecchino and returned the Kuvaki to Krai. Exactly how How powerful are those two now? Strong enough to rival Archons, perhaps? If Celestia awakens, how will they react to the presence of these long-lost powers? What part will Columbina have to play in that? And now that she's regained her power and been accepted by Teyvat, will the Tsaritsa try to bring her back as a Harbinger once more? After all, most of them are dead or missing at this point. And like, Dottore isn't really dead, right? That glitch on the title screen at the end of the quest looked just like the powers he used to twist reality. We already knew he had segments which could work independently, and the burning of Irminsul has not yet happened. And since he's such a fantastic antagonist, surely they can't throw him away that easily. Obviously, I'm hoping we get more Archon quests in Krai which begin to explore these questions, but I would be shocked if they were all answered before we set out towards Nesnaya, and besides, some answers just lead to more questions. All of this is why I wanted a wider story to be better integrated into the Archon quests. There's so much I want to know now, which used to feel like background noise which did not matter. Even though this was the first time I expected a satisfying finale to a region story, they still managed to exceed those expectations. There are still aspects which I'd have wanted to be handled differently, and others where I think they fell back into bad habits, but on the whole it was fantastic, and most of my complaints are me wishing for a slightly different story rather than a better one. They kept the best parts of what they'd created in the past, and added so much more into Krai that it feels like a completely different game, but one which recaptures the soul which made so many fall in love with Teyvat in the first place. Let's hope they keep it going. Until next time.